License and registration. Those four words sound simple until you hear them through a cracked window at night, with red and blue lights flashing behind you, your heartbeat climbing, your hands suddenly feeling awkward on the steering wheel, and an officer standing just outside the glass watching every tiny movement you make. A lot of drivers think traffic stops are only about speeding tickets or broken taillights. They are not. In 2026, traffic enforcement across the United States is changing in ways many drivers still do not fully understand. And some of these changes are happening quietly enough that people won't realize the danger until they are already standing on the shoulder of the road trying to explain themselves. Have you ever been pulled over and later realized the officer seemed more interested in your behavior, tone, or hesitation than the actual traffic violation itself? Tell me your experience in the comments, because a lot of people discover too late that the stop was never really about the original reason they were pulled over. And stay with me, because later I'm going to explain one mistake drivers make during casual conversation that quietly gives officers far more control over the situation than most people realize. One thing drivers need to understand right now is that traffic enforcement in America is moving toward behavior analysis, technology-assisted observation, and stricter distracted driving enforcement. A lot of people imagine police officers sitting around waiting to catch someone going 15 over the speed limit. In reality, modern traffic stops often begin with observation long before the lights come on. The officer may already have noticed how long it took you to react to a green light. They may have seen you glance down repeatedly. They may have noticed inconsistent lane position. Maybe you braked too late. Maybe you touched the center line once. Maybe your speed changed slightly when you passed the patrol car. Drivers think these details are meaningless. Officers do not. That matters because many states heading into 2026 are expanding hands-free enforcement, increasing penalties tied to distracted driving, and supporting wider camera-based enforcement systems. Some jurisdictions are also experimenting with intelligent speed control programs for repeat offenders and more aggressive work zone monitoring. Now here's where people get caught off guard. A driver gets pulled over believing the stop is only about speed. The officer walks up calmly and says, "Where are you headed tonight?" The driver thinks they are being friendly, so they start talking casually. Then the officer asks again in a slightly different way, "Where are you coming from?" Then again, "How long were you there?" A lot of people don't realize this repeated questioning is not random conversation. Officers are often checking consistency, reaction time, eye movement, speech rhythm, nervousness, and whether details change under pressure. That does not automatically mean the officer thinks you committed a serious crime, but it does mean the officer is evaluating whether this stop should stay simple or become something more investigative. And this is where 2026 traffic enforcement trends are becoming more serious. Law enforcement agencies are increasingly trained to identify impairment beyond obvious drunkenness. We are moving into an era where impaired driving is being interpreted more broadly, including fatigue, distraction, medication influence, delayed reactions, and behavioral indicators. Federal discussions around advanced impairment detection technology in vehicles are also pushing this issue into public debate. Now let me be very clear because there is a lot of misinformation online. Some people are screaming that every car in America is getting a government kill switch tomorrow morning. That is not accurate. But there absolutely is ongoing federal pressure toward technology capable of detecting impaired driving behavior in future vehicles, and drivers should pay attention to where this is heading. The bigger issue right now is not futuristic technology. It is how officers interpret behavior during real roadside encounters. Imagine this scenario. You are driving home after work. You are tired. Maybe you had a stressful day. You drift slightly within your lane one time while adjusting navigation. That alone may not get you stopped. But then you brake harder than normal approaching an intersection. Now an officer notices. Then you hesitate at a green light because you are reading a message preview on your phone. That combination starts building a picture. The officer activates the lights. Immediately, your stress level rises. Your breathing changes. Your voice changes. Your hands shake while reaching for documents. Drivers don't realize how much nervous behavior can accidentally reinforce suspicion, especially if the officer already believes distraction or impairment may be involved. Then comes another critical moment most people mishandle. The officer asks for license, registration, and proof of insurance. The driver starts digging aggressively through the glove box while speaking quickly. "It's here somewhere. Hold on. I know I have it. Sorry. Just give me a second." What feels normal to the driver can look chaotic to the officer. Remember, officers are trained to notice unusual movement patterns, divided attention, and hand activity. They do not know if you are simply disorganized or trying to hide something. One reason traffic stops escalate unnecessarily is because drivers do too much too fast. Slow movement matters, tone matters, silence matters, even eye contact matters. A calm driver who moves carefully and speaks clearly usually changes the emotional temperature of the stop immediately. But people sabotage themselves because they panic internally and start over-explaining everything. And here is a mistake that creates huge problems. A driver answers questions they were never actually required to answer, then later tries to backtrack after realizing they said too much. That transition changes the officer's perception instantly. For example, an officer asks, "Have you had anything to drink tonight?" The driver laughs nervously. "Just one beer with dinner." Now maybe that is true. Maybe it was hours ago. Maybe the driver is fully sober. But notice what just happened psychologically. The officer now has a reason to continue evaluating impairment because the driver voluntarily introduced alcohol into the conversation. Then comes the next layer. When was that? What restaurant? What time exactly? What kind of beer? How many ounces? Who were you with? You can feel the pressure building during these moments because every answer creates another doorway into more questioning. A lot of viewers think officers are simply trying to trap people. Sometimes officers are genuinely trying to determine whether someone is unsafe to drive. But drivers should also understand something important. Once suspicion begins developing, officers often continue gathering observations until they either eliminate that suspicion or strengthen it enough to justify further investigation. And that is why body language becomes incredibly important during modern traffic stops. If the driver suddenly stops making eye contact, touches their face repeatedly, changes speech patterns, becomes argumentative, or answers inconsistently, officers notice immediately. Police training places enormous emphasis on behavioral indicators. Many people do not realize how much a stop becomes psychological within the first 60 seconds. Now let's talk about phones, because this is becoming one of the biggest enforcement targets in America. Drivers still think holding a phone low near the lap is invisible. It is not. Officers sitting higher in SUVs can often see directly into vehicles. At intersections, they observe reflections on faces, downward eye movement, thumb motion, and delayed reaction timing. Some distracted driving enforcement operations even place officers in elevated positions specifically to catch phone use patterns. And here is the dangerous misconception people keep repeating. If I'm stopped at a red light, I can check my phone. That is not universally safe legally anymore. In many hands-free jurisdictions, simply holding or manually interacting with the phone while operating the vehicle can still create a violation, even temporarily stopped in traffic. Drivers also underestimate how distracted driving stops can evolve into broader investigations. The officer walks up and says, "I observed you using your phone." The driver instantly becomes defensive. "No, I wasn't. You can't prove that. I was checking GPS. I just touched it for 1 second." Now the emotional tone shifts. The officer starts paying closer attention to attitude, odor, eye condition, speech, and movement because conflict increases suspicion. A stop that could have ended with a warning suddenly becomes prolonged because the interaction became confrontational too early. This is another thing people rarely understand. Officers are constantly evaluating risk level. If a driver appears cooperative and predictable, the stop often remains calm. But unpredictable emotional swings change everything. A driver starts overly friendly, then irritated, then sarcastic, then silent, then angry. Officers notice these transitions because inconsistency creates uncertainty, and uncertainty changes officer behavior. Now let's discuss one of the most misunderstood moments during any traffic stop in America: the request to step out of the vehicle. People online love to say, "Never get out of the car." That advice can create serious problems. Under long-established Supreme Court rulings, officers generally have authority to order drivers out of vehicles during lawful traffic stops. Refusing physically or escalating emotionally usually makes the situation worse very quickly. But here is what drivers should understand psychologically. The moment you step out of the vehicle, the environment changes completely. Inside the car, drivers feel protected. Outside the car, people suddenly feel exposed, vulnerable, uncertain. Officers know this. That shift can affect speech, balance, breathing, and nervous behavior. And officers observe all of it. The way you exit matters. Do you stumble? Do you lean on the door? Do you avoid eye contact? Do your hands shake? Do you continue reaching toward pockets after instructions? Tiny details become major observations in police reports. Now, imagine another realistic scenario. The officer returns your documents but keeps talking. This confuses many drivers. People think once documents come back, the stop is over automatically. Not always. An officer may continue asking questions, hoping for consent to search, additional admissions, or contradictory statements. Drivers often accidentally extend stops themselves by continuing casual conversation when they were already free to leave, or close to being free to leave. This becomes especially important in states increasing highway drug interdiction efforts and aggressive corridor patrols. And here is where many innocent people unintentionally create suspicion. The officer asks, "You don't mind if I take a quick look inside the vehicle, right?" Now the driver freezes mentally because they don't want to seem guilty, so they start rambling. "Well, there's nothing in there. I just don't really, I'm kind of in a hurry." That hesitation alone changes the atmosphere. People need to understand something uncomfortable about traffic stops. Silence feels suspicious to many drivers because humans naturally want to explain themselves under pressure. But excessive talking creates opportunities for inconsistency. Sometimes the smartest thing a driver can do is remain calm, respectful, and brief. Another huge issue in 2026 is automated enforcement and how drivers emotionally react to being watched more closely on roads. Many jurisdictions are increasing work zone speed monitoring, camera systems, and automated citation technology. Drivers often believe these systems are only revenue generators, but lawmakers are framing them as responses to rising injury and fatality rates in high-risk zones. Here is the problem. When people know enforcement is increasing, many become hyper-aware while driving. That sounds good in theory, but nervous driving creates strange behavior. Drivers suddenly brake hard near patrol cars. They slow unpredictably. They stare into mirrors repeatedly. They grip the wheel stiffly. They drift lanes because attention shifts away from actual driving. Officers recognize cop-aware driving instantly. Sometimes the behavior itself attracts attention more than the original violation would have. And passengers need to pay attention too, because modern stops increasingly involve passenger observation. Imagine an officer approaches the passenger side and notices the passenger avoiding eye contact while stuffing something under the seat. Now the entire tone changes. Or the passenger starts speaking aggressively before the driver even answers. "Why did you stop us? We didn't do anything. You cops always do this." That emotional interference immediately increases tension because officers now have divided attention and uncertainty about control of the encounter. Passengers often make stops worse unintentionally. And here is another reality many people dislike hearing. Officers are trained to notice rehearsed behavior. Some drivers watch internet videos trying to memorize perfect phrases for traffic stops. Then, during the actual stop, they sound robotic and unnatural. "I do not consent. Am I being detained? I invoke my rights." The words themselves are not necessarily wrong. The problem is tone, timing, and context. If the driver sounds aggressive, performative, or confrontational from the first 10 seconds, officers may become more cautious and defensive themselves. Real roadside interactions are human interactions under stress. That matters. One of the most dangerous myths online is the idea that every officer approaches every stop looking for a fight. That is simply not reality. Most officers want predictable, safe interactions that end quickly without escalation. But officers are also trained to expect unpredictability because traffic stops remain one of the most dangerous parts of policing. Think about the officer's perspective for a second. It is dark. Cars are flying past. The officer does not know who is inside the vehicle. They do not know if the driver is intoxicated, armed, wanted, exhausted, emotionally unstable, or simply distracted. That uncertainty shapes officer behavior from the moment they walk toward the car. And drivers who understand that dynamic usually handle stops more effectively than drivers who immediately treat every interaction like a courtroom battle. Now let's talk about delayed compliance, because this issue is becoming more common with younger drivers especially. An officer says, "Please keep your hands visible." The driver continues scrolling through the phone. Maybe they are texting someone. "I got pulled over." Bad idea. The officer repeats the instruction more firmly. Now tension enters the stop, because repeated commands force officers to evaluate whether the non-compliance is confusion, distraction, nervousness, or intentional defiance. Small delays can dramatically alter how officers perceive risk. The same thing happens when drivers continue searching for documents after being told to stop moving, or when they suddenly reach towards center consoles without warning. People underestimate how quickly uncertainty escalates roadside interactions. Another major issue developing in 2026 involves repeat speeding enforcement and speed-limiting technology discussions for habitual offenders. Some states are exploring or expanding systems that can physically restrict vehicle speed for certain high-risk drivers. Now, whether people agree with these programs or not, drivers need to recognize the larger trend here. Traffic enforcement is shifting away from simple punishment after violations and toward prevention systems designed to stop dangerous behavior before it happens. That changes the entire relationship between drivers, vehicles, and law enforcement, and many drivers are emotionally unprepared for it. People still think of driving as total personal freedom. Legislators increasingly think in terms of public safety analytics, behavioral monitoring, and injury reduction. Those two mindsets are colliding right now across America. You can already feel it during modern traffic stops. Officers are asking more observational questions. Vehicles contain more monitoring systems. Roadways contain more cameras. Insurance companies track behavior more aggressively. Distracted driving enforcement keeps expanding. Meanwhile, drivers are often less patient, more stressed, more distracted, and more emotionally reactive than ever before. That combination creates dangerous roadside encounters. Now here is something most drivers never consider until it happens. The friendly officer can change tone instantly. The stop begins casually. "How's your night going?" Then suddenly, "Step out of the vehicle." The emotional shock catches people off guard because they mistake politeness for certainty about the stop's direction. In reality, officers can remain conversational while still evaluating escalating suspicion internally. That tonal switch is one reason drivers become emotional so fast during stops. They feel betrayed. But from the officer's perspective, the situation evolved based on observations gathered during the interaction. And yes, sometimes officers make mistakes too. Absolutely. There are cases involving unlawful prolonging of stops, questionable searches, improper pressure tactics, or unnecessary escalation. Drivers should understand their rights, but they should also understand roadside reality. Arguing legal theories on the shoulder of a highway at midnight rarely improves outcomes. Documenting events calmly afterward is usually far smarter than escalating emotionally in the moment. Now let's discuss silence, because this topic creates endless confusion online. Silence is legal, but silence is psychologically difficult. An officer asks a question, the driver says nothing. Then comes silence. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Most people cannot tolerate that pressure. They start talking simply to break tension. That is why officers sometimes repeat questions slowly. "Where are you coming from tonight?" Silence creates discomfort, and discomfort often produces voluntary information. This is basic human psychology, and nervous drivers often reveal far more through emotional behavior than actual words. Breathing changes, swallowing increases, speech pace changes, voice cracks, hands tremble. Officers are trained observers. Drivers should never forget that. Another issue becoming more common is officers paying closer attention to fatigue indicators. Long work hours, rideshare driving, overnight commuting, and phone distraction have blurred the line between exhaustion and impairment. A tired driver can display behaviors similar to intoxication. Drifting, delayed response, confusion, slow speech, poor coordination. That creates difficult roadside situations because the driver may genuinely believe they are safe while the officer sees warning signs. And here is something uncomfortable but true. Many dangerous traffic stop outcomes begin with ego. The driver feels embarrassed. The officer feels challenged. Both become emotionally invested. That is when simple stops spiral into arrests, roadside confrontations, or reckless decisions. A driver who says, "I know my rights," in an aggressive tone, often changes the emotional chemistry immediately. Again, rights matter, absolutely, but human emotion matters too. The roadside is not a debate stage. It is an unstable environment filled with stress, uncertainty, noise, flashing lights, passing traffic, and adrenaline. Drivers who stay emotionally controlled usually make better decisions. And before I finish, I want to talk about one final mistake that quietly destroys many traffic stops. Trying too hard to appear innocent. People think innocent behavior looks overly cheerful, talkative, cooperative, and eager. Sometimes that actually increases suspicion because it feels unnatural under stress. A calm, normal, respectful demeanor is usually more effective than exaggerated friendliness or non-stop explanations. If an officer asks a simple question, answer simply. If you are searching for documents, move slowly. If you need to reach somewhere, say it first. If you disagree with the stop, save emotional arguments for later. And remember this carefully, because almost nobody talks about it honestly. The stop does not end emotionally when the ticket is handed over. A lot of drivers pull away angry, distracted, embarrassed, or shaky. That emotional state itself becomes dangerous. People speed off. They stop paying attention. They replay conversations mentally instead of focusing on driving. Some even commit another violation immediately after the stop, because adrenaline is still flooding their system. That is one reason experienced officers sometimes pause before letting drivers leave. They are watching whether the driver appears emotionally stable enough to re-enter traffic safely. Traffic enforcement in America is changing. The laws are tightening in many areas. Technology is becoming more involved. Officers are being trained to observe behavior more deeply. And drivers are carrying more distraction, more stress, and more emotional tension into every interaction than ever before. The next time those lights appear behind you, the most important thing happening may not be the speed you are driving at all. It may be the next 30 seconds after you pull over. The silence, the breathing, the movement of your hands, the first answer you give. And whether you understand that a traffic stop is never just about the law on paper. It is also about psychology, perception, timing, and pressure unfolding in real time on the side of the road, while both you and the officer are trying to decide what kind of encounter this is about to become. chp.ca.gov/news-alerts/new-list/new-dash-highlights-public-safety-laws taking effect in 2026/Clession. UTM_source equals chatgpt.com. New year, new laws. CHP highlights public safety laws taking effect in 2026. NHTSA.gov/sites/NHTSA.gov/files/2026-03/report to Congress Advanced Impaired Driving Prevention Technology.pdf. UTM_source equals chatgpt.com. February 2026 report to Congress. www.reddit.com/r/UTM_mercury_underscore insurance/comments/uno-t3 PSA. A lot of drivers are breaking no-touch laws without realizing it. www.reddit.com/r/motorbus/comments/1s4pjv8/code speeding_twice in Illinois, the state wants, UTM_source egalte, chatgpt.com. Code speeding twice in Illinois, the state wants to take control of your car's top speed.